His mistress called me daily, describing intimate details of their relationship. She'd laugh about how pathetic I was, how easily I was being replaced. For months, I listened to her cruelty in silence. Then I invited her to coffee at the place where she thought she was meeting him. What she found instead changed everything. The phone rang at exactly 7:43 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, the same time it had rung every Tuesday for the past 3 months. I was stirring pasta sauce when I heard that familiar, sickeningly sweet voice on the other end. "Chloe? It's Mila. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." The way she said my name, like it tasted bitter on her tongue, made my stomach clench. But I steadied my breathing, set down the wooden spoon, and prepared myself for another session of calculated torture. "Hello, Mila." My voice came out exactly as I'd practiced. Weary, defeated, with just enough tremor to suggest I was barely holding myself together. "I just had to call and tell you about the most amazing weekend Nolan and I had." She paused, savoring the moment like expensive wine. "We went to that little bed and breakfast in Monterey, you know, the one with the ocean view? He said you two used to go there for anniversaries." Before we continue, if you believe women deserve to reclaim their power and never accept being silenced, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women who need this. Now let's see how I fought back. My fingers tightened around the phone. Seaside Haven. We'd spent our first anniversary there, our third, our fifth. I remembered the way Nolan used to trace patterns on my back while we listened to the waves crash against the rocks below our window. The memory felt like a physical blow, but I swallowed the pain and let it fuel my resolve. "That sounds lovely," I managed, injecting just enough sadness into my tone to make her feel victorious. "Oh, it was more than lovely. He told me he'd never felt so free, so alive. He said being with you had become like wearing a coat that was 3 sizes too small, suffocating and uncomfortable." Her laugh was sharp, designed to cut. "He even said your cooking had gotten boring. Same 5 meals on rotation," he told me. "Like eating at a nursing home." I glanced at the pasta sauce, his favorite recipe, one I'd perfected over 7 years of marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was preparing dinner for a man who apparently mocked my cooking to his mistress. "I see," I whispered, letting the words hang in the air like a confession of defeat. "You know what the best part was, though?" Mila continued, her voice taking on that particular tone of cruelty that had become her signature. "He said he feels guilty sometimes, but then he remembers how you've let yourself go. She doesn't even try anymore," he said. "When I come home, she's in those awful sweats, hair in a messy bun, looking like she's given up on life." I touched my hair self-consciously. It was indeed in a messy bun, and yes, I was wearing comfortable clothes. But I'd been working from home, managing our household, trying to keep our life together while he was apparently dissecting my appearance with another woman. The silence stretched between us. I could hear her breathing, waiting for me to break, to beg, to give her the dramatic reaction she craved. Instead, I practiced the technique I'd perfected over these months of torture. I let the pause extend just long enough to suggest I was fighting back tears, then delivered my response in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. "Is that so? Oh, Chloe." Her voice dripped with false sympathy. "I almost feel sorry for you. Almost. But then I remember that you're living in a fantasy, thinking you still have a marriage worth saving." I walked to the kitchen window, staring out at the garden where Nolan and I had once planned to build a swing set for the children we'd dreamed of having. The wooden stakes were still there, marking the corners where we'd measured and discussed and hoped. Now they looked like tiny gravestones in the fading light. "Last Thursday," Mila continued, "we went to that new restaurant downtown, Bella Vista? The one with the private booths? He said he'd been wanting to take you there for your birthday, but then he realized he'd rather share new experiences with someone who actually appreciates them." My birthday. 3 weeks ago. He'd taken me to our usual chain restaurant, claimed he'd forgotten to make reservations anywhere special. I'd pretended not to mind, had even smiled and thanked him for the generic card he'd obviously picked up last minute from the gas station. "He's so thoughtful," I said, my voice breaking just slightly on the last word. It wasn't entirely acting. The betrayal still stung even though I'd known about it for months. "He really is. And the gifts, Chloe. The jewelry, the lingerie, the weekend getaways. He told me he'd stopped buying you things because you never seemed to appreciate them. She'd rather have practical gifts," he said. "Vacuum cleaners and coffee makers. No romance left in her." I remembered the last gift he'd given me, a new set of kitchen knives for Christmas. I'd thanked him, used them to prepare meals he apparently complained about to his mistress. The cosmic joke of it all was almost funny in a twisted way. "He sounds very generous," I replied, adding a slight sniff to suggest I was crying. "Oh, he is. Last week he surprised me with a weekend in Napa Valley. We stayed at this incredible resort, the kind of place where they bring champagne to your room and draw baths with rose petals. He said he'd never done anything like that for anyone before. Mila makes me want to be romantic again," he told me. "She brings out the man I used to be." I closed my eyes, remembering our 10th anniversary just 6 months ago. He'd taken me to dinner at a chain restaurant and given me a gift card to Target. I'd convinced myself that practical love was more mature, more stable than grand gestures. "That's wonderful for you both," I said, my voice hollow. "You know what I think, Chloe?" Mila's tone shifted, becoming more direct, more vicious. "I think you're holding on to something that's already dead. He doesn't love you anymore. He doesn't want you. He's just too much of a coward to file for divorce himself." The words hit their mark, but not in the way she intended. Instead of crushing me, they crystallized something I'd been feeling for months. A strange sense of power that came from knowing something she didn't. "Maybe you're right," I said, letting my voice crack with what she would interpret as defeat. "I know I'm right. And honestly, I'm doing you a favor by calling. Someone needs to wake you up from this pathetic delusion that you still have a husband." I heard Nolan's car in the driveway, the familiar sound of his engine shutting off, his footsteps on the front porch. He'd be walking through that door any moment, expecting dinner and normalcy, having no idea that his mistress had just spent 20 minutes describing their intimate moments to his wife. "I should go," I said softly. "He's home." Of course he is. Back to his boring, predictable life with his boring, predictable wife. Mila's laugh was sharp and triumphant. "Enjoy your evening, Chloe. I know I'll enjoy mine thinking about how pathetic this all is." The line went dead just as Nolan walked through the front door. He looked tired, slightly guilty, but he smiled when he saw me. "Something smells amazing," he said, hanging his coat in the closet. "What are you making?" "Your favorite pasta," I replied, turning back to the stove. "How was your meeting?" "Long, boring. You know how it is." He came up behind me, placed his hands on my shoulders. "I'm sorry I've been working so much lately. I know it's hard on you." I leaned back against him, feeling the weight of his hands, the warmth of his body. 3 months ago this moment would have filled me with love and forgiveness. Now it felt like a performance we were both giving, though only I knew we had an audience. "It's okay," I said. "I understand." What I didn't tell him was that I understood far more than he realized. I understood that while he was apologizing for working late, his mistress was probably getting ready for bed, replaying our conversation and feeling victorious. I understood that his guilt was making him kinder to me, more attentive, which only made Mila's cruelty more potent. But most importantly, I understood something that neither of them knew yet. Something that would change everything. As I served dinner, I thought about the 3 pregnancy tests hidden in my dresser drawer, all showing the same result. 43 days along according to my calculations. A secret that would shift the balance of power in ways that Mila, with all her cruel phone calls and detailed descriptions of their affair, could never imagine. I watched Nolan eat the pasta he'd apparently called boring, compliment the sauce he'd mocked to another woman, and I smiled. Not the defeated smile of a broken wife, but the quiet smile of someone who knew that the game was about to change completely. The phone would ring again on Thursday morning, right after he left for his business meeting. Mila would call with more stories, more cruelty, more attempts to break me down. And I would listen, respond with my practiced weakness, and let her believe she was winning. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is let your enemy think they've already won, while you prepare to show them exactly how wrong they are. That night, as Nolan slept peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling and let my mind drift back to the darkest chapter of our marriage, one he believed was buried and forgotten. It had been 8 months ago when I'd first seen those 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test. The joy that flooded through me was so pure, so overwhelming that I'd actually laughed out loud in our bathroom. We'd been trying for over a year and finally it was happening. I'd planned the perfect way to tell him. A small gift box with tiny baby shoes inside, placed on his pillow while he was in the shower. I could still remember the look on his face when he opened it. Not joy, not excitement, but something that looked almost like panic. Are you sure? He'd asked, his voice strangely flat. 3 tests, I'd said, beaming. All positive. We're going to be parents, Nolan. He'd hugged me then, said all the right words, but something in his embrace felt wrong. Too tight, too desperate, like he was trying to squeeze the life out of something. The weeks that followed were a blur of strange behavior I'd attributed to normal expectant father nerves. He'd become obsessively attentive about my evening routine, insisting on making my chamomile tea himself every night. You're growing a baby, he'd say with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Let me take care of you. The tea tasted different somehow, more bitter with an earthy undertone I couldn't place. When I mentioned it, he'd laugh and say he was trying a new brand, something organic and supposedly better for pregnant women. I'd drink it gratefully, touched by his thoughtfulness. The cramping started on a Tuesday morning, sharp and low in my abdomen. By evening there was blood. By Thursday it was over. These things happen, the emergency room doctor had said gently. First trimester losses are more common than people realize. There's nothing you could have done differently. I'd grieved deeply, blamed myself for weeks. Nolan had been supportive in all the right ways, bringing me flowers, holding me while I cried, suggesting we wait a few months before trying again. His relief, which he thought he was hiding, felt like salt in an open wound. The follow-up appointment 3 weeks later was routine. Blood work, physical exam, the doctor checking to make sure everything was healing properly. I almost didn't go. What was the point of examining the aftermath of failure? Dr. Martinez had frowned at my blood results, then frowned deeper. Chloe, I'm seeing some unusual markers in your system. Have you been taking any herbal supplements? Anything not prescribed? No, I'd said, confused. Just prenatal vitamins and the calcium tablets you recommended. She'd pulled out a reference chart, her expression growing more concerned. I'm seeing traces of blue cohosh and pennyroyal. These are herbs that can cause uterine contractions. They're sometimes used to induce labor or other things. The bottom dropped out of my world. Other things. In high enough concentrations they can cause miscarriage. They're dangerous, especially in the first trimester. She'd looked at me carefully. You're certain you haven't taken anything containing these herbs? I'd driven home in a daze, her words echoing in my mind. When I'd gotten to our kitchen, I'd torn through every cabinet, every drawer, looking for something I hoped I wouldn't find. Behind Nolan's vitamin bottles, pushed far back where I'd never think to look, I discovered a small brown bottle labeled Evening Blend Women's Wellness Tea. The ingredient list read like a catalog of everything Dr. Martinez had found in my blood. Blue cohosh, pennyroyal, black cohosh, and other herbs I'd never heard of. I'd stood there holding that bottle, my hands shaking, while the truth crashed over me like a physical blow. My husband, the man who'd held me while I cried over our lost baby, had been the one who'd killed it. The rage that filled me was so pure, so white-hot, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. I'd wanted to confront him immediately, to scream and throw things and demand answers. Instead, I'd carefully placed the bottle back where I'd found it and made a decision that would change everything. I would never tell him I knew. Over the following months, I'd watched him with new eyes. The way he'd suggest we wait longer before trying again. How he'd carefully monitor my cycle, becoming anxious around ovulation. The relief in his posture when my period would arrive each month. His mother had started dropping hints about grandchildren during family dinners, and I'd watched Nolan deflect with practiced ease. We're not ready yet, he'd say. Maybe next year. But his eyes would find mine across the table and I'd see the warning there. Don't you dare contradict me. The most sickening part was how considerate he'd become afterward. Flowers for no reason, surprise dinners out, weekend getaways to bed and breakfasts. I'd thought he was trying to help me heal from our loss. Now I realized he was celebrating. During one of those weekends, to a place called Seaside Haven, ironically the same place Mila had mentioned on the phone, he'd been particularly affectionate. We'd walked along the beach at sunset and he'd pulled me close. I love our life just the way it is, he'd said, kissing my temple. Sometimes I think we're perfect as we are, you know? Just us. I'd smiled and agreed even as my stomach churned. Just us. No complications, no children to complicate his perfectly controlled world. But Nolan had underestimated his own father, a man who'd seen through his son's selfishness long before I had. The conversation had happened during our last Christmas together, just 3 months before the miscarriage. Nolan's father, William, had pulled me aside while Nolan was outside helping his mother with something. "Chloe," he'd said, his weathered hands gentle on my shoulders. "I want you to know something important. When you give this family its first grandchild, and you will, everything will shift in your favor." At the time, I'd thought it was just a sweet comment from a man who desperately wanted grandchildren. William had always been kinder to me than his wife, more accepting, more genuinely warm. He'd treat me like the daughter he'd never had, while his actual son treated me like an inconvenience. "That's very sweet, William," I'd said. "I hope we can give you grandchildren soon." His eyes had grown serious. "I'm not being sweet, dear. I'm being practical. I've made sure of it." I hadn't understood what he meant then. After he'd passed away suddenly from a heart attack 6 weeks later, the comment had faded into the background of grief and funeral arrangements. It wasn't until 6 months after his death, when the lawyer had finally sorted through the estate documents, that the full picture emerged. The will had been revised just 2 months before his death, and buried in the legal language was a clause that made my blood run cold. Upon the birth of William Foster's first biological grandchild, the document read, "The following assets shall be transferred into an irrevocable trust for said child. The rental property at 847 Maple Street, portfolio account number 4471 with Meridian Investments, and a 40% ownership stake in Foster & Sons Hardware." The trust would be managed by the child's primary legal guardian, a role that, by law and by William's specific designation, would fall to me as the mother, not to Nolan as the father. I'd read that clause over and over, my hands trembling. The rental property alone was worth over $300,000. The investment portfolio had grown to nearly $180,000. And Foster & Sons Hardware, while small, was profitable and provided steady income. Suddenly, Nolan's desperate opposition to having children made perfect sense. It wasn't about not wanting to be a father. It was about not wanting to lose control of money he considered his inheritance. The bitter irony was devastating. His father had seen his son's true nature and had crafted the perfect insurance policy. William had known that any grandchild of his would need protection from Nolan's selfishness, so he'd created a financial safety net that would activate the moment that child was born. Nolan knew about this clause. He'd been present when the will was read, had seen the lawyer explain the terms. His face had remained carefully neutral, but I'd noticed how his jaw had tightened, how his hands had clenched in his lap. No wonder he'd been so desperate to prevent my pregnancy. No wonder he'd resorted to herbs and manipulation instead of just having an honest conversation about not wanting children. A conversation would have required him to admit he was prioritizing money over my dreams of motherhood. Now, lying in the darkness beside him, I placed my hand on my still flat stomach where a new life was growing. 43 days along, and this time I was the only one who knew. This pregnancy wasn't just about the baby I'd longed for, it was about justice. It was about a wise old man's foresight and a father's love protecting his future grandchild from his own son's greed. Nolan shifted beside me, murmuring something in his sleep. Probably dreaming about Mila, about his carefully constructed double life where he got to play the romantic leading man while keeping his boring wife safely contained and childless at home. He had no idea that his world was about to change forever. That his father's final gift was growing inside me, bringing with it not just new life, but a complete redistribution of power. The man who'd poisoned his own wife to prevent losing money was about to discover that some things were more powerful than his control, more permanent than his schemes. And I was going to enjoy every moment of his realization. 3 weeks passed before I made my move. 3 weeks of Mila's regular calls, each one more vicious than the last, each one adding another layer to my growing plan. She'd grown bolder, more detailed in her descriptions, clearly feeding off what she perceived as my increasing weakness. But I wasn't getting weaker. I was getting ready. The pregnancy symptoms had started in earnest. Morning queasiness that I hid from Nolan by claiming I had a stomach bug, exhaustion that I blamed on work stress. Every secret symptom felt like armor I was putting on, piece by piece preparing for battle. I spent hours researching the perfect location for our confrontation. It had to be public enough that she couldn't cause a scene, intimate enough for a private conversation, and symbolic enough to give me the psychological advantage I needed. Murphy's Diner sat on the corner of 5th and Main, its red vinyl booths and checkered floors unchanged since the 1950s. Nolan and I had discovered it during our second year of marriage, when we'd been apartment hunting in that neighborhood. Every Sunday morning for 3 years we'd shared coffee and pancakes there, planning our future over bottomless cups and warm syrup. I told him once that Murphy's felt like the place where we'd fallen deepest in love, where all our dreams had taken shape. He'd laughed and kissed powdered sugar off my lips, promising we'd bring our children there someday for birthday breakfasts and celebration dinners. The irony of choosing that location wasn't lost on me. In a place where I'd once planned a future with him, I was about to destroy the future he'd built without me. I arrived at 1:30, 30 minutes before the meeting I'd arranged. The lunch crowd was thinning out, leaving mostly empty booths and the low murmur of afternoon coffee drinkers. I chose the corner booth where Nolan and I used to sit, positioning myself with a clear view of the entrance and my back to the wall. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes and sensible shoes, approached with a coffee pot. "Just coffee today, honey?" "Yes, please. I'm waiting for someone." I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, using its heat to steady my nerves. At exactly 1:45, I pulled out the burner phone I'd purchased with cash the week before. The app I'd downloaded let me send texts from any number, and I'd already programmed in Nolan's contact information. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I crafted the message that would bring Mila running. "Can't wait to see you. Murphy's at 2. Need to talk about us." And I'd studied Nolan's texting patterns for months, noting his tendency toward brief messages, his habit of signing texts with his initial when he was being romantic. I'd even referenced their dinner at Bella Vista from the week before, adding just enough specificity to make the message believable. Her response came back within seconds. "Finally. I've been hoping you'd say that. See you soon." The heart emoji made my stomach turn, but it also confirmed what I'd suspected. She thought this meeting was going to be significant. Maybe she was expecting him to finally leave me or propose, or make some grand declaration. Whatever she was expecting, it definitely wasn't me. I ordered a slice of apple pie I had no intention of eating, just to give myself something to do with my hands while I waited. The clock on the wall ticked toward 2 o'clock with agonizing slowness. At 2:03 the diner door chimed and she walked in. Mila moved like someone who owned every room she entered, her heels clicking confidently against the checkered floor. She wore the red dress she'd described to me in excruciating detail during one of her calls. The one Nolan had supposedly said brought out the color in her eyes, the one she'd worn to their dinner at that expensive steakhouse downtown. Her dark hair was styled in perfect waves, her makeup flawless despite the afternoon heat. She'd clearly put effort into looking stunning for what she thought would be a romantic meeting with my husband. Her eyes swept the diner, searching for Nolan's familiar figure. I watched her face change as she processed the mostly empty restaurant, the absence of the man she'd come to meet. Her gaze landed on me last and I saw the exact moment recognition dawned. Confusion flickered first. Why was the pathetic wife sitting in the restaurant where she was supposed to meet her lover? Then came anger, sharp and immediate as she realized she'd been deceived. Finally, that familiar smirk of superiority settled over her features, the same expression I'd learned to hate during our phone conversations. "Wow." Her voice carried clearly across the quiet diner, causing several customers to look up from their meals. "This must be rock bottom for you, Chloe. Did you really think ambushing me would change anything?" She clutched her designer purse like a weapon, her whole body radiating the kind of confidence that comes from believing you're untouchable. Other diners were starting to stare, but their attention didn't seem to bother her. If anything, she seemed to enjoy having an audience for my humiliation. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle her. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, almost conversational. "Sit down, Mila. Please." "I don't think so." She turned to leave, her heels already clicking toward the door. "Whatever pathetic plea you've prepared, I'm not interested in hearing it. I'm not here to fight." The words stopped her mid-stride. "I just thought you should know something important." She turned back, one perfectly shaped eyebrow raised in skeptical amusement. "What could you possibly tell me that I don't already know?" I gestured to the empty seat across from me. "Sit. Just for a minute." Something in my tone must have intrigued her because she hesitated. Maybe it was the lack of desperation in my voice, or the fact that I wasn't crying or begging like she'd expected. After a moment she slid into the booth across from me, but perched on the edge like she might bolt at any second. You have 2 minutes, she said, checking her watch with theatrical impatience. Then I'm leaving and I'm calling Nolan to tell him about your little stunt. I studied her face, memorizing the smugness in her expression, the certainty that she held all the power in this situation. In a few seconds that certainty would shatter completely. I'm pregnant, I said simply. The words hung in the air between us. I watched her process them, saw the moment when their significance hit her. Her confident smile faltered just slightly. Congratulations, she said finally, but her voice had lost some of its edge. I'm sure Nolan is thrilled. 43 days along. I continued as if she hadn't spoken. And this time he can't stop it. That got her attention. Her eyes sharpened, focusing on me with new intensity. What do you mean, this time? I didn't answer directly. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out the folded copy of William's will that I'd been carrying for weeks, waiting for exactly this moment. The paper was slightly worn from handling, but the legal language was still crisp and clear. I placed it on the table between us, right next to the untouched slice of apple pie, and slid it toward her. You don't have to believe me about the pregnancy, Mila. But he will. I tapped the document with one finger. And when you ask him about this, you'll understand exactly why. Her laughter was sharp and too loud for the quiet diner, causing the elderly couple 2 booths over to frown in our direction. You really think a baby is going to make him choose you? That's adorable. She leaned back in the booth, her confidence returning as she dismissed my revelation. He's already told me about your desperate attempts to trap him with a pregnancy. It's honestly pathetic how predictable you are. Read it, I said quietly. I don't need to read anything. You're delusional if you think. Read it. My voice carried a note of authority that surprised us both. Trust me, you'll want to understand what you're really dealing with. Something in my tone must have penetrated her arrogance because she picked up the paper. I watched her eyes scan the legal language, saw the exact moment when she reached the crucial clause about the trust fund. Her face went through a series of expressions, confusion, disbelief, and finally, a dawning understanding that drained the color from her cheeks. I stood up, placing exact change for my coffee on the table. The pie remained untouched. I'd lost my appetite weeks ago and today was no exception. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, Mila, I said, my voice perfectly pleasant. I'm sure you and Nolan will have a very interesting conversation. I walked toward the exit without looking back, but I could feel her eyes burning into my back. The door chimed as I stepped out into the afternoon sunshine, and I couldn't resist glancing through the large front window. Mila was hunched over the document, her perfect posture completely forgotten. She was reading it again, her phone pressed to her ear, probably calling Nolan, demanding explanations for things she'd never thought to question before. Her confident smile was gone, replaced by the kind of frown that comes with realizing you've been playing a game where someone else knew all the rules. I drove home slowly, savoring the image of her bent over that piece of paper, finally understanding that the pathetic wife she'd been tormenting for months had just shown her exactly who held the real power. I didn't have to wait long to see the ripple effects of my revelation. That evening, as I sat in my garden watering the tomato plants I'd been nurturing all summer, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Mila. We need to talk. Call me. I deleted the message without responding. She'd had her chance to talk at Murphy's diner. Now she could experience the same helplessness I'd felt during those months of cruel phone calls, reaching out to someone who had no interest in answering. 20 minutes later, another text. I know you're getting these. Answer your phone. Then another. We both know you're not as innocent as you pretend to be. I turned my phone face down and continued watering my plants. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was nurturing life while her world was probably falling apart somewhere across town. My neighbor, Mrs. Chin, looked over the fence with concern. Everything all right, dear? You seem distracted. Just enjoying the quiet, I said, which was true. For the first time in months, my phone wasn't ringing with scheduled cruelty. The real fireworks began the next day. I was having lunch with my sister Rachel when Nolan called, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Chloe, we need to talk. Can you come home? Now. I'm having lunch with Rachel. What's wrong? Just, please, come home. The desperation in his voice was something I'd never heard before, not even during our worst fights. Rachel raised an eyebrow as I gathered my purse. Trouble in paradise? Something like that. I kissed her cheek goodbye. I'll call you later. The drive home felt like traveling toward a storm I'd been watching build on the horizon for months. I found Nolan pacing in our living room like a caged animal, his hair disheveled, his shirt wrinkled like he'd been tugging at it. She knows, he said without preamble. Mila knows about the pregnancy. I see. I settled into my favorite armchair, the one by the window where I'd spent so many evenings reading while he claimed to be working late. How did she find out? Did you tell her? His eyes were wild, searching my face for answers. We had coffee yesterday. I kept my voice conversational, almost casual. He stopped pacing. You what? She thought she was meeting you. Murphy's Diner, 2 o'clock. She seemed quite disappointed when I showed up instead. The color drained from his face. Chloe, what did you do? I told her the truth. About the baby. About your father's will. I watched him carefully, noting how his hands trembled slightly. She didn't take it well. Nolan sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. She's been calling me nonstop. Demanding explanations. She found some lawyer, started asking questions about inheritance law. Smart woman. Almost meant it. What did you tell her? What could I tell her? She already knew everything. He looked up at me, and for the first time in our marriage I saw genuine fear in his eyes. She asked me if the pregnancy was real. I couldn't lie to her, not when she was staring at a legal document. The admission hung between us. He'd confirmed my pregnancy to his mistress before even acknowledging it with me. And then, I prompted. She started connecting dots I never wanted her to see. His voice cracked slightly. She asked about your first pregnancy, about why I was so desperate to prevent this one. She's not stupid, Chloe. She figured out what happened before. There was the moment when his carefully constructed narrative began to crumble. She said you told her I'd had desperate attempts to trap you with pregnancy. Is that really how you described our lost baby to her? Nolan's silence was answer enough. She asked me what I meant when I said I'd handle the situation like before. The words came out in a rush, like a confession he couldn't hold back anymore. I didn't realize how it sounded until she repeated it back to me. I imagined the scene. Mila's growing horror as she realized the man she'd been sleeping with had sabotaged his own wife's pregnancy. The man she thought was romantic and passionate was actually calculating and cruel. What else did she say? She called me a monster. He laughed bitterly. Said she'd been mocking the wrong woman all along. That you'd played her like a chess piece while she thought she was the one in control. Pride swelled in my chest, surprising me with its intensity. Even in her anger and disgust, Mila had recognized the truth. I'd outmaneuvered them both. She's done with me, Nolan continued. Blocked my number, returned everything I ever gave her. Her last text. He pulled out his phone, read from the screen with a hollow voice. You made me waste 8 months on a woman who was always 3 steps ahead of both of us. The text was even more cutting than I'd hoped. Mila hadn't just rejected him, she'd made sure he knew exactly why. She'd seen through his manipulation and found it pathetic rather than charming. The worst part, Nolan said, his voice barely above a whisper, is that everyone's going to know. She's already told people at her office, her friends. She's not keeping this quiet. I'd expected this. Mila's pride had been wounded, her intelligence insulted. Of course she'd want people to know she hadn't been the naive other woman. She'd been outsmarted by the wife everyone thought was weak. Over the following days the social fallout became apparent. Nolan came home each evening looking more defeated, reporting on conversations with mutual friends who'd heard Mila's version of events. Brad asked me if it was true that I'd been messing with your head during the affair, Nolan said one night, staring into his untouched dinner. Sarah's wife heard I'd been manipulative and controlling. The narrative was shifting. Instead of being seen as a man torn between 2 women, Nolan was being viewed as someone who'd been dishonest with both. Mila's version painted him not as a romantic figure but as a manipulator who'd used and deceived everyone around him. Janet from your office called, I mentioned casually. Mila's putting in for a transfer. Apparently she can't stand to be in the same city anymore. His fork clattered against his plate. She's leaving. Phoenix office. Some kind of promotion opportunity. I'd done my research, called Janet myself to confirm the details. She starts next month. The news seemed to devastate him more than anything else. Not only had Mila rejected him, but she was erasing any possibility of reconciliation by putting 2,000 miles between them. She told Janet something interesting, I continued. Said she'd learned an important lesson about not underestimating quiet women. That sometimes the person you think is powerless is actually the one holding all the cards. Nolan's face crumpled. I've lost everything, haven't I? Not everything, I said quietly. You still have choices to make. But we both knew the truth. His carefully constructed double life had collapsed in a matter of days. The woman he'd thought was desperate and pathetic had orchestrated his downfall with surgical precision. And the mistress who'd made him feel powerful and desired now saw him as a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating your opponent. Mila's departure was swift and final. No dramatic confrontations, no attempts to win him back. She simply vanished from our lives as efficiently as she'd entered them, leaving behind only the wreckage of Nolan's ego and the grudging respect I felt for a woman who'd been smart enough to recognize when she'd been outplayed. The phone calls stopped completely. The evening torture sessions that had defined my life for months were over, replaced by a silence that felt like victory. I'd won, but more importantly, I'd taught them both a lesson they'd never forget. Sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who lets you think you're winning right up until the moment you realize you've already lost. The weeks following Mila's departure settled into a strange rhythm. Nolan moved through our house like a ghost, appearing at mealtimes with hollow eyes and mechanical politeness. He'd ask about my day, comment on the weather, offer to help with dishes, all while carefully avoiding any mention of the pregnancy that was becoming impossible to hide. I was 12 weeks along now, and the morning sickness had given way to a small but noticeable bump that I no longer bothered to conceal. I'd catch him staring sometimes, his eyes lingering on my changing body with an expression I couldn't quite read. Longing? Regret? Fear? Perhaps all three. On a Thursday evening in late September, exactly 3 weeks after Mila had sent her final devastating text, I was arranging the baby books I'd bought earlier that day when I heard footsteps on our front porch. Not Nolan's usual confident stride, but something hesitant, almost shuffling. The doorbell rang at exactly 7:43 p.m. The same time Mila used to call with her carefully timed cruelty. I opened the door to find my husband standing there like a stranger asking for shelter. He'd lost weight. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and his face had taken on the gaunt appearance of someone who'd forgotten how to sleep properly. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually perfect hair was disheveled, like he'd been running his hands through it compulsively. Chloe. His voice cracked on my name. Can we talk? I stepped aside without a word, and he entered our home like he was walking into foreign territory. He paused in the entryway, his eyes taking in the small changes I'd made. The pregnancy books on the coffee table, the prenatal vitamin bottle on the kitchen counter, the What to Expect magazine folded open to an article about second trimester nutrition. You look. He stopped himself, seeming to realize that commenting on my appearance might not be wise given recent history. Different. I supplied. Pregnant. Healthy. Each word was deliberately chosen, a reminder of what he'd tried to prevent. Beautiful, he said quietly. You look beautiful. I led him to the living room, settling into my usual chair while he remained standing, fidgeting with his car keys like a nervous teenager. I've been staying at the extended stay off Highway 12, he said without preamble. 3 weeks now. Giving you space, trying to figure out how to fix this. The information surprised me. I'd assumed he was still sleeping in our guest room, maintaining the illusion of normalcy. The fact that he'd been living in a hotel suggested a level of self-awareness I hadn't credited him with. Have you figured it out? I asked. His laugh was hollow, self-deprecating. No. Not even close. He finally sat down, perching on the edge of the couch like he might flee at any moment. But I know I can't keep pretending this isn't happening. The baby, I mean. Our baby. Hi baby, I corrected gently. You made your feelings about children quite clear. He flinched. Chloe, I need you to know how sorry I am. Not just about Mila but about what I did to you. To our first baby. The words hung in the air between us. This was the first time he'd acknowledged his role in my miscarriage directly, without euphemisms or deflection. I was selfish. Controlling. I thought I could manage everything, keep everything exactly the way I wanted it. Tears were streaming down his face now, and I was surprised to find that they affected me more than I'd expected. I didn't realize what I was destroying until it was too late. What changed? I asked. 3 weeks ago you were still lying to both of us. What's different now? He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so vulnerable it was almost painful to watch. Losing Mila wasn't what broke me. It was realizing she was right, that you'd been 3 steps ahead of me the entire time. That while I thought I was so clever keeping secrets and managing situations, you knew everything. Not everything, I said honestly. I didn't know about the herbs until much later. His face crumpled. How did you find out? I told him about Dr. Martinez, about finding the bottle in our kitchen, about the months of silence that followed. I watched him absorb each detail, saw the moment when he truly understood the depth of what he'd done. You've known for months, he whispered. All this time you knew what I did and you never said anything. What would you have wanted me to say? I don't know. Scream at me. Hit me. Something other than this. He gestured vaguely at my calm demeanor. How can you just sit there and talk about it like we're discussing the weather? Because screaming wouldn't bring our baby back, I said simply. And it wouldn't protect this one. He was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of my words. Is that what all this was about? The coffee with Mila, showing her the will. Was it all about protecting this pregnancy? Partly. I placed my hand on my small bump, a gesture that drew his eyes immediately. But it was also about taking back control of my own life. I want to be part of it, he said suddenly. This pregnancy, the baby's life. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking anyway. The request didn't surprise me. I'd been expecting it since the moment Mila left. But the timing felt significant. He was asking on a Thursday evening at the exact time his mistress used to call to torment me. Whether intentional or not, it felt like he was trying to reclaim that hour, to fill it with something better than the cruelty it had once held. I have a doctor's appointment next Tuesday, I said carefully. 16-week checkup. We might be able to learn the gender. Hope flickered in his eyes. Would you let me come with you? I studied his face, noting the way he held his breath while waiting for my answer. Why should I? Because I want to be better. I want to be the father this baby deserves, the husband you deserved all along. The words came out in a rush, like he'd been rehearsing them. I know I can't undo what I did, but maybe I can do better going forward. What does better look like to you? I asked. He seemed unprepared for the question. Honesty. No more secrets. No more trying to control everything. And if the baby changes our financial situation? If the trust activates and I become the manager of assets you consider yours? His jaw tightened. A flash of the old Nolan, the one who viewed everything in terms of control and ownership. But then he forced his expression to relax. Then we figure it out together. As partners. Partners, I repeated. Is that what we were when you were slipping herbs into my tea? No. The word came out flat, defeated. We weren't partners. I was a manipulator and you were someone I was trying to control instead of love. The admission was more honest than anything he'd said in years of marriage. It also highlighted exactly why I couldn't simply forgive and forget. I'll think about the appointment, I said finally. Relief washed over his features. Thank you. That's more than I deserve. Yes, I agreed. It is. Over the following days, Nolan began what could only be described as a campaign to prove his worthiness. He brought groceries without being asked, left prenatal vitamins on my nightstand, researched the best pediatricians in our area. When I mentioned that I'd signed up for a birthing class, he asked, tentatively, if I'd consider letting him attend. But for every gesture of consideration, I felt the weight of everything that had come before. The herbs hidden behind his vitamins. The months of phone calls while he said nothing. The way he'd described me to his mistress as boring, demanding, desperate. Some wounds were too deep for grand gestures to heal. Some trust, once broken, couldn't be rebuilt with good intentions and prenatal vitamins. Still, I found myself softening in small ways. When he asked about the birthing class, I told him I'd consider it. When he offered to help set up the nursery, I didn't immediately refuse. Not because I was ready to forgive him, but because I was beginning to understand the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. I could forgive him for my own peace of mind. But trusting him with my heart again? That was a different conversation entirely. That conversation about forgiveness versus trust became the foundation for everything that followed. Over the next few months, as my pregnancy progressed and our daughter grew stronger inside me, I made decisions that prioritized my peace over Nolan's comfort, my future over his regrets. The birth itself was transformational in ways I hadn't expected. As I held our daughter for the first time, Emma Rose, named after my grandmother, I felt something click into place. This tiny person with her perfectly formed fingers and serious dark eyes represented everything I'd fought for. Not just the pregnancy itself but my right to make choices about my own life. Nolan was there, had been throughout the labor, holding my hand when I let him, stepping back when I needed space. When Emma was placed in my arms, I saw him cry, real tears, not the calculated emotion of his campaign to win me back, but genuine overwhelm at meeting his daughter. "She's perfect," he whispered, his finger tracing her tiny hand. "Yes," I agreed. "She is." But even in that moment of shared wonder, I knew our family would look different than the one I'd once imagined. The trust activated automatically upon Emma's birth, just as William had designed it. Within weeks, I was managing a rental property that generated enough monthly income to cover Emma's future education expenses. The stock portfolio provided additional security, and my 40% stake in Foster & Sons Hardware meant I now had a voice in business decisions that affected our financial future. Nolan watched this transfer of power with a complex mix of emotions: pride in his daughter, grief for what he'd lost, and a grudging respect for his father's foresight. He never once challenged the arrangements, perhaps understanding that any attempt to contest his father's will would only highlight his own manipulation and greed. 6 months after Emma's birth, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I enrolled in business management courses at the community college, taking advantage of their evening program while Nolan watched Emma during his scheduled visits. "You're going back to school?" my sister Rachel asked during one of our weekly coffee dates. "At 35 with a new baby? Why not?" I bounced Emma gently in my arms, marveling at how natural motherhood felt despite everything that had led to it. The trust provides financial stability, and I finally have the freedom to pursue something for myself. The freedom was intoxicating. For the first time in my adult life, I was making choices based purely on what I wanted, not what someone else expected or demanded. I studied marketing and accounting, learned about property management and investment strategies. Knowledge became another form of independence. Nolan and I settled into a co-parenting arrangement that worked because I controlled every aspect of it. He saw Emma twice a week, Tuesday evenings and Saturday afternoons, plus every other weekend. The schedule was my design, implemented on my timeline with boundaries I enforced consistently. "I'd like to take her to the park this Saturday," he might suggest during one of our brief handoff conversations. "Which park?" I'd ask. "The one on Elm Street with the good playground. Be back by 4. She has a routine." He never argued, never pushed for more time or different arrangements. Perhaps he understood that cooperation was the only path to any relationship with his daughter. Perhaps he'd finally learned that my boundaries weren't suggestions. The business courses led to unexpected opportunities. Professor Martinez, coincidentally sharing a name with the doctor who'd helped me discover Nolan's deception, mentioned that Foster & Sons Hardware was looking for someone to modernize their marketing approach. "You own part of that business, don't you?" she asked after class one evening. 40%, I confirmed. "Have you considered getting more involved? Bringing some fresh perspectives to their operations?" The idea hadn't occurred to me, but once planted, it grew quickly. I scheduled a meeting with the current manager, brought proposals for online sales platforms and social media marketing, suggested efficiency improvements based on what I'd learned about small business operations. Within 6 months, I was working part-time as Foster & Sons marketing and operations consultant. The additional income wasn't necessary. The trust provided more than enough security, but the work gave me purpose and professional identity I'd never had during my marriage. Nolan heard about my involvement through the family grapevine. When he brought Emma back from a Saturday visit, he lingered longer than usual. "I heard you're working at the hardware store now," he said, his tone carefully neutral. 3 days a week. Emma comes with me sometimes. She likes watching the customers." That's great, Chloe. Really. Dad would have loved seeing you take an active role in the business." It was one of the few times he'd mentioned his father without bitterness, and I recognized it as genuine. Whatever resentment he felt about the trust, he seemed to understand that his father's decision had been protective rather than punitive. The personal growth extended beyond professional achievements. I learned to speak up in situations where the old Chloe would have remained silent. When Emma's pediatrician suggested a treatment approach I disagreed with, I voiced my concerns and sought a second opinion. When a neighbor made comments about single mothers that felt judgmental, I corrected his assumptions about my situation with polite firmness. "You've changed," Rachel observed during one of our coffee dates, watching me confidently handle a difficult server who'd gotten our order wrong. "Have I?" I shifted Emma to my other arm, noting how natural the movement had become. The old Chloe would have just accepted the wrong order and pretended it was fine. He was right. The woman who'd silently endured months of cruel phone calls was gone, replaced by someone who understood that peace didn't require accepting mistreatment. Even my relationship with Emma carried lessons about power and choice. When she cried inconsolably during her colicky phase, I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is set firm boundaries. Putting her in her crib for 5 minutes while I collected myself, rather than letting frustration build to dangerous levels. "You're a natural at this," Nolan said one evening when he picked her up and she immediately calmed in his arms. "I'm learning," I corrected. "There's a difference." The distinction mattered. Natural implied some innate ability, but learning suggested conscious choice and effort. Everything about my new life had been learned, chosen, deliberately constructed rather than simply accepted. 18 months after Emma's birth, I had occasion to drive past Murphy's diner. The same red vinyl booths were visible through the windows, the same checkered floor that had witnessed my confrontation with Mila. But instead of painful memories, I felt only quiet satisfaction. That afternoon had been the beginning of everything, not just Mila's downfall or Nolan's consequences, but my own transformation. The moment I'd slid that will across the table, I'd stopped being a victim and started being the author of my own story. Through mutual acquaintances, I'd learned that Mila had indeed married, to a divorced architect in Phoenix who apparently appreciated her intelligence and ambition. Good for her. Everyone deserved a chance at happiness, even someone who'd once taken pleasure in causing pain. I rarely thought about her anymore except when something reminded me of that time, like driving past Murphy's or hearing a phone ring at 7:43 p.m. Those moments served as reminders of how far I'd traveled, not as sources of ongoing anger. Emma babbled from her car seat as we passed the diner, pointing at something outside her window with the serious concentration of a 15-month-old making important observations about the world. "That's right, sweetheart," I said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "There's a lot to see out there." And there was. A life I'd built through patience and strategic thinking rather than drama and revenge. A future that belonged entirely to us, free from the toxic patterns that had once defined my daily existence. The woman who'd once listened silently to cruelty was gone. In her place was someone who spoke up, who made choices, who protected what mattered most. Someone who understood that true power wasn't about controlling others. It was about never again allowing others to control you. If this story of strategic revenge had you holding your breath, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Chloe slid that will across the table, watching Mila's confidence crumble completely. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more empowering stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.